A quick cross-reference with Ultimate Therapist supported the notion that this was a prudent course of action. But still, his first impulse was to reject the idea. He did not see the logical purpose of it. What would hugging her accomplish, other than getting him dirty? There was no rational reason for... His inner musings trailed off when he looked at Nanami, hunched over with her arms wrapped around herself, tears and snot running down her face. That pain stabbed his heart again. For only the second time in his life, a great compulsion to act overcame him. He stood from his chair and approached her. Slowly, his hand extended. It came to rest at the back of Nanami's head, so light she didn't seem to feel it. For just a moment, an uncharacteristic uncertainty crippled Izuru. Then he shook it off and nudged her forward into his chest. She started and stopped crying, a surprised little noise escaping her throat. Her shock was only to be expected. It was the first time he had ever initiated physical contact for non-assistance purposes. For a moment, she was still, and he began to suspect he'd miscalculated. But then, her trembling arms came up around his back, clutching him tight. Nanami buried her face in his shirt and resumed sobbing, the sound slightly muffled by fabric. Keeping his hand on her head, Izuru noted with some interest that his muscles were unusually tense as he stood there, her tears dampening his shirt. It was an emotion akin to awkwardness, but not as discomforting. Rather than returning her embrace, his other arm hung stiffly at his side, but Nanami didn't seem to care. Somehow, this seemed to have helped her, but he couldn't comprehend how. Actually, on further reflection, this was like when they'd gone to the store and she'd held his hand after the attack. He hadn't rationalized the purpose for it at the time, but it had felt pleasant, so he'd allowed it. Judging from her reactions then and now, though, the contact seemed to be reassuring to her. Why, he still couldn't explain. But the results were there, so he mentally compartmentalized physical contact as comfort for Nanami. Then he waited for her to calm down. By his estimate, it took her a good 15 minutes to stop crying. At some point, her legs gave out, and he was forced down to the floor with her. Now they sat against the wall. Nanami still hadn't let him go, and so she was twisted rather awkwardly, half on his lap and half curled up to his side. The skin around her eyes was puffy and red, and faint tear stains were visible on her cheeks. "You deserve to be alive," Izuru finally said. "Your judgment is clouded by guilt and despair currently. Ergo, the conclusion you have reached is false. It will fade in time." She shuffled quietly, but did not look convinced. So he added, "If that is not enough to convince you, then think of your desire to see your friends again. You cannot do that if you perish." Although Nanami didn't answer, her face showed she was mulling his words over. Judging now was an apt time, he fished the Game Girl Advance out of his pocket and handed it to her. The pink-haired girl blinked, taking it with shaking hands. Her eyes grew wet, and Izuru automatically began to calculate the odds of her crying again. She finally spoke, voice raw with emotion.
"You fixed it?"
He didn't see why that seemed to have such an impact on her. "It is of some import to you." She stared at it for a long moment, lower lip trembling. Wiping her eyes with one hand, Nanami quietly set the device down on the floor beside her, then settled back into his body. Izuru memorized the way his heart leapt at that, to analyze at a later date.
"Thank you."
Speaking as gently as he could, he prodded, "Why do you feel you failed your classmates?" She sighed.
Because before she left, I promised Yukizomi-sensei I'd protect them. It was my duty as class rep. And I couldn't do that. Worse, I led them into danger. So, it's definitely all my fault.
Izuru agreed with that assessment. You do have blame. You should have perceived that fighting Enoshima was an unwise course of action, or at the very least, left some classmates behind to get assistance. Not doing so was indeed a failure on your part.
Wow. Your empathy skill could really use some work.
But the fault does not solely lie with you, he continued. Had Enoshima not initiated the actions she did, you never would have been in that situation in the first place. So why are you giving yourself the blame that belongs to her? Nanami was silent. When she spoke, her voice was very small.
It's not that easy, okay? I'm not like you. I can't just rationalize away my emotions.
It was rather ironic she'd said that when Izuru was trying and failing to do just that right then. With her warm body pressed against his and her breath tickling the junction of his neck and shoulder, he was finding himself getting rather illogically distracted. You can live with them without letting them conquer you. That is what the therapy is for. More silence, but finally, Nanami took a deep breath and nodded into his shoulder.
I'll try.
It wasn't as easy as that, of course. There were more medications, more therapy sessions, more spilling of her heart onto him, more leaning on his quiet presence. A month of therapy later, and she still had nightmares, still had bad days where she wanted to lie in bed. But she was improving at her own pace. They established goals, just like with the physical therapy. Get her to talk about what had happened, repeatedly. Get her to talk about how she felt. Slowly lessen the amount of guilt and sadness she felt. Find possible triggers so she could avoid them. It was difficult, and she broke down crying more than once, but it was helpful. Kamakura-kun surprised her by eventually suggesting a pet, saying studies showed that the responsibility that came with them was helpful for people with depression. After some time thinking it over, she'd tentatively agreed. He disappeared for the rest of the day, only to return with a small brown rabbit in a cage. He'd informed her he would perform necessary veterinarian checks, but other than that, he wouldn't interact with it at all. It was solely her responsibility, so it would die without her. For some reason, that actually encouraged Chiaki more. Thinking about how the rabbit, whom she'd named after Yumigami, after a character in one of her video games, would go hungry if Chiaki didn't care for her, got her out of bed on bad mornings.
I can do this small thing,
she'd think as she gently fed her bits of lettuce.
I'm not worthless. Here's something that loves me unconditionally. I just need to focus on doing what I can.
The afternoon was peaceful. Her cane rested within an arm's reach as she relaxed on the couch. Kamakura-kun was on her other side, fingers tapping away at his laptop. Impulsively, she patted his hand, the contact sending a tingly feeling through her, and he paused in a deliberate way. There'd been a shift of some sort that day when he gently embraced her. Chiaki wasn't quite sure what it was exactly, but she knew she'd liked being held by him. He'd been warm, like a stone that had bathed in sunlight, and he'd been safe, and it had been nice, really nice. And she'd realized she was starting to get starved for human contact, and now that she'd had a taste, she had to have more. So she touched him more often, just occasionally took his hand or hugged him when he went out or came back, harmless little things like that. Whenever she did, he would narrow those vivid eyes and examine her closely, but he didn't seem to dislike it. She hoped he didn't dislike it. He'd tell her if he did, right? She flushed and looked down at Yumigami, who was sitting contentedly in her lap as Chiaki stroked her with her other hand. Petting her was very soothing. She was a quiet animal, and the way she bumped her head against Chiaki's hand was adorable, usually eliciting a giggle from her. It helped keep the foul, negative thoughts away. Chiaki smiled and closed her eyes.
It's not easy. I'm struggling. But I'm still here. I'm not alone. I'm still alive, and I deserve to be alive. And if I'm alive, then someday, maybe I can try to make things right.
End of Chapter 10. Author's note. Excuse me while I pull my hair. Ugh. I spent so long going over this chapter that it's kind of lost all meaning to me. PTSD is a subject I wanted to handle respectfully, so I did research, hence the slightly longer than normal wait for the chapter. One of the things I looked up is how real therapists treat people with it, and the technique Izuru uses actually is one of them. Though I don't think Chiaki's quote-unquote over it. Its effect will still hang over her for quite a while. She's just doing better now. One thing that's interesting to me is seeing characters handle being the switched role in a relationship. For example, Chiaki is pretty much always the comforter in Hinanami Kamunami fanfics, which is a given since that's what she does in the game and show. So having her have a breakdown and need to be the one comforted just once is interesting to write, especially when the other is someone like Izuru, who is not at all prepared for providing emotional support. His section definitely took me the most time to write. Internet cookies to anyone who can guess which game Yumigami's name comes from without Google.